AI is not the problem. Technology and economic crisis. Imagine self-driving cars. We've been told this great technological achievement is not very far in the future. Soon, driving may be a thing of the past, and artificial intelligence, computer sensors, and other innovations may be applied in a way that makes automobile transportation completely automated. In a rational society, this would be a cause for nothing but celebration. The amount of human labor that goes into driving could be expended elsewhere. We could move to a higher level of material abundance with one form of human labor no longer necessary. We do not live in a rational society. We live in a society governed by money and profits. And in our highly irrational, market centered economy, self driving cars would be a complete nightmare. It is a nightmare that is already hanging over us. As Andrew Yang told the New York Times, quote, all you need is self-driving cars to destabilize society. We're going to have 1 million truck drivers out of work who are 94% male with an average level of education of high school or 1 year of college. We have 5 to 10 years before truckers lose their jobs and all hell breaks loose. In the society we live in, this high-tech 21st century for-profit American economy, human beings live by selling their labor power to a boss. If someone is unable to sell their labor power, they are rendered unemployed, and it becomes very difficult to feed, house, and clothe themselves. Even in the good old days of the 1950s, when the U.S. economy was booming, you still had lots of hungry stomachs in Appalachia, the rural South, and impoverished urban centers. Despite its once big, prosperous middle class, America has always had an underclass of those who often populate the prisons and the lower ranks of the military. Among this permanent underclass, there's always been a significant overrepresentation of African Americans, Chicanos, and people of color, though there have been plenty of white people in it as well. The existence of this permanent layer of impoverished workers is something that U.S. media has aimed to cover up. It is a strong argument against the image the U.S. elite seeks to present of a land of unending prosperity. However, these are not normal times in America. The conditions that have always been present for some are now expanding to the bulk of the population. 60% of American workers are living paycheck to paycheck. Food banks are overwhelmed with demand. The percentage of children living in households deemed to be food insecure by the U.S. Department of Agriculture has risen. The suicide rate and deaths from alcohol poisoning and drug overdoses are rising. The infrastructure of the United States, from the power plants to the water treatment facilities to the roads and bridges, is falling apart. The life expectancy of Americans has decreased to the lowest point in 25 years. Though the economic crisis is the basis, there is a wider cultural and spiritual crisis that has unfolded. There is a political crisis as the elite battle each other and seek to resolve the crisis with heavy-handed force. The root of this crisis can be found in economics, and this book will put forward primarily economic solutions. The economic foundations of our society must be reinvented so that all human creativity, labor, and natural resources can be found in the vast territory of the country can be unleashed once again to create huge amounts of growth. Where do profits come from? We do not live in a society where houses are built because people need shelter. We do not live in a society where food is grown, processed, and packaged because people need to eat. We live in a society where the guiding force of production is profit. Houses are built so that landlords and banks can make money from selling or renting them. Food is produced so agribusiness corporations and big box stores can make money selling it. Apple makes iPhones, Kraft makes cheese, and other major corporations operate on the basis of maximizing profits for their shareholders. Profit is in command of production. The banks, the major media, the means of transportation, the oil wells, all the major players in our economy operate so that those who own them can get a return on their investment. This is the definition of capitalism. In our time, there's a huge amount of confusion about what exactly capitalism is. Capitalism is not a term for having money. Money existed in ancient Rome, in Greece, and in medieval Europe. China was printing paper money before Marco Polo ever visited this thriving civilization. Capitalism is not synonymous with money, and many non-capitalist societies have money. Capitalism is not synonymous with inequality either. There was inequality in feudalism. There was inequality in the slave civilizations of ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. There is inequality in the socialist, non-capitalist societies that exist around the world. Capitalism, as Mao Zedong, the founder of the Chinese Revolution, put it, is defined by profits in command. Friedrich Engels defined capitalism, saying, under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Karl Marx wrote about the anarchy of production. Capitalism is the economic system we live under in the United States, and it is defined as production organized to make profits for private owners. As William Z. Foster, the leader of the Great Steel Strike, explained, the basic contradiction of capitalism, the source of all its weakness and its final dissolution, is found in the fact that this system does not carry on production for the benefit of society as a whole, but for the profit of a relatively small owning class. The great industries by which society must live are owned by private individuals who work ruthlessly to exploit the masses who work in these industries. Under capitalism, production is regulated not by the needs of the masses, but by whether or not the capitalist class can make a profit by such production. Commodities are not produced primarily for use, but for profit. So in a capitalist society where production is organized for the profit of private owners, how are these profits created? Where do profits come from? The truth is that profits can only come from human labor. Imagine you had a capitalist who manufactured pens. The cost of the materials to go into the pens shall be represented by A. The cost of the shipping of the pens shall be represented by B. And the labor cost of the employees he hires shall be represented by C. The final cost of the pen, which is paid to the consumer who purchases it, shall be represented by D. A plus B plus C equals D, right? A plus B plus C equals D. The cost of the pen is the combined total of the materials, the shipping, and the labor costs. But there is a problem. How can the capitalist who set this up make a profit, a return on his investment? The owner cannot change how much the materials cost. A must remain untouched. The owner cannot change how much the shipping costs. B must remain untouched. The profits that the capitalist makes can only be extracted from C, which is the value put into the pen by the labor costs from which the capitalist can extract his profits. So in order to ensure that profit is made from each pen, our equation must be corrected. A plus B plus C1 plus C2 equals D. A plus B plus C1 plus C2 equals D. C1 represents the wages the worker is actually paid. C2 represents the surplus value that is extracted by the employer as profit. This is how production is done under capitalism. And capitalism has always had a built-in problem. The cause of the boom-bust cycle in which the market goes up and down is this. C1 does not equal D. The final cost of the pen is always significantly higher than the wages paid out to the worker to produce it. If this is extrapolated throughout the entire economy, we see the problem. The wages paid out to workers who produce products are never enough to purchase the products that they produce. This is called the problem of overproduction. The worker can never buy back what he produces. The market inevitably has more products than it can sell. Karl Marx wrote about this problem of overproduction in capitalism. John Maynard Keynes, another economist, called it underconsumption. The result of overproduction is what economists call a glut. This is a situation where the market has so many goods that prices drop, businesses close down, workers lose their jobs, and the economy experiences a downturn. The problem of overproduction and gluts is a problem that only exists in capitalism. In previous societies, people were homeless because there was not enough housing. People were hungry because there was a shortage of food. But only under capitalism are people hungry because there is too much food. Only under capitalism are people homeless because there is too much housing. Capitalism creates a problem that is simply irrational, a problem of poverty amid plenty, poverty created by abundance. The more wealth that is created, the poorer people get. This is expressed by a famous dialogue labeled The Coal Miner's Riddle, which takes place between a father and a son. Father, why is it so cold? Can we turn on the stove to keep warm? Says the son. Father, no, we don't have any coal to heat the stove. Son, Father, why don't we have any coal to heat the stove and keep warm? Father, because I cannot afford it. Son, why can't you buy any coal? Father, because I've lost my job at the coal mine. I was laid off. I am now unemployed. Son, why did you lose your job at the coal mine? Father, because there is too much coal. Production for profit will always have this built-in problem of overproduction. In the U.S. state of Missouri, there is a cave where $1.4 billion in this U.S. state of Missouri, there is a cave where 1.4 billion pounds of cheese have been buried. Why does the U.S. government purchase so much cheese simply to bury it in a cave? Because this keeps the price of cheese and other dairy products from dropping. It is just one artificial mechanism among many created to deal with the problem of overproduction. The governments of the world have developed all kinds of mechanisms to attempt to abet the economic turbulence created by overproduction. The U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, the various corporate subsidies that are distributed, the military-industrial complex, the food stamps program, the huge amounts of government spending on various projects are all necessary to keep the capitalist economy churning along, despite the fact that a huge amount of the wages paid out will never be enough to purchase the products. Karl Marx wrote of this in the 1848 Communist Manifesto. He wrote, "It is enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return put the existence of the entire bourgeoisie on its trial, each time more threateningly. In these crises, a great deal of the existing products, but also the previously created productive forces, are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce have been destroyed. Why? Because there's too much civilization, too much subsistence, too much industry, and too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society can no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these forces. And so, as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society and engender the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them." Marx's close collaborator Friedrich Engels explained it this way. "As a matter of fact, since 1825, when the first general crisis broke out, the whole industrial and commercial world, production and exchange among all civilized people and their more or less barbaric hangers-on are thrown out of joint about every 10 years. Commerce is at a standstill, the markets are glutted, products accumulate as the multitudinous as they are unsaleable. Hard cash disappears, credit vanishes, factories are closed. The mass of workers are in want for the means of subsistence because they have provided too much of the means of subsistence. Bankruptcy follows upon bankruptcy, execution upon execution. The stagnation lasts for years. Productive forces and products are wasted and destroyed wholesale until the accumulated mass of commodities finally filter off, more or less depreciated in value, until production and exchange gradually begin to move again. Little by little, the pace quickens. It becomes a trot. The industrial trot breaks into a canter, and the canter turns into a headlong gallop of a perfect steeplechase of industry, commerce, credit, and speculation, which finally, after breakneck leaps, ends where it began, in the ditch of a crisis, and so over and over again." Explaining the roots of the problem, Engels wrote, "Money, the means of circulation, becomes a hindrance to circulation. All the laws of production and circulation of commodities are turned upside down. The economic collision has reached its apogee. The mode of production is in rebellion against the mode of exchange. The whole mechanism of the capitalist mode of production breaks down under the pressure of the productive forces of its own creations. It is no longer able to turn all this mass of means of production into capital. They lie fallow, and for that very reason, the industrial reserve army must lie fallow. Means of production, means of subsistence, available laborers, all the elements of production of general wealth are present in abundance. But the abundance becomes a source of distress and want, because it is the very thing that prevents the transformation of the means of production into subsistence, into capital. For in capitalist society, the means of production can only function when they have undergone preliminary transformation into capital, into the means of exploiting human labor power. The necessity of this transformation into capital, of the means of production and subsistence, stands like a ghost between these and the workers. It alone prevents the coming together of material and personal levers of production. It alone forbids the means of production to function and the workers to work and live. William Z. Foster explained it this way. Naturally, a worker getting a wage of $3 to $5 a day cannot buy back the 10 to 20 or more dollars worth of commodities that he produces. This gap between producing and buying power widens by the constant increase in the worker's productive capacity through machinery, and the speed up also by the lowering of living standards. The capitalist wastes huge masses of these stolen commodities through luxurious living, by the creation of hordes of parasitic occupations, by immense military establishment and wars. They seek to dispose of them by export and trade. But the surpluses are not exhausted by these means. There is an inevitable tendency to glut the market with unsellable commodities. Even though, as now, the millions of producers who make up the bulk of the population may actually starve and die for the want of the barest necessities of life, the market suffers from overproduction. The falling rate of profit. However, the constantly existing problem of overproduction gets worse in certain periods. The capitalist wants to sell as many products as possible, and at the same time, he wants to pay as little wages as he can. The capitalist is competing with the other capitalist. He is motivated to make the highest amount of profit by selling the most products. One of the main ways a capitalist can increase the huge amount of profit he makes by selling products is to reduce labor costs. Replacing workers with machines makes it cheaper to produce products. The fewer workers that are hired, the more profits the capitalist can make. But this also presents a new problem. Let's revisit our equation. A plus B plus C equals D. A plus B plus C1 plus C2 equals D. In our equation, C represents the value put into the product by the labor to the worker. As we can see, the profit to the capitalist is extracted by cutting into this value. The wages the worker receives are C, and the capitalist profits are represented by C2. As the capitalist reduces labor costs by replacing workers with machines, he cuts into his own profits. The cost of the machines that replaces the workers is unchanging. He can only make profits from human labor. As the percentage of D, the final cost of the product, that is input by C, human labor, goes down, C2 must also go down. The more efficient production becomes, the smaller amount of profit the capitalist can make on each product. Because the capitalist is making less and less profit per item he produces, with his rate of profit decreasing, he is incentivized to produce more and more to make up for the loss. The already existing problem of overproduction becomes compounded by this problem, which is called the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, or the falling rate of profit. With the worker being paid less and less as their place at the assembly line decreases, their ability to buy products decreases. With the capitalist seeing the rate of profit he makes on each product going down, his drive to produce and sell more and more products in order to maintain his profits increases. This all leads to a situation where the market is glutted with products that cannot be sold. The worker cannot afford to buy them, and the capitalist is driven to produce more and more than ever because the amount of profit he makes on each item has decreased. In his book, The Future is Up to Us, Nelson Peary explained, what does robotics demand? The robots demand that their production be given away because there is no value to their production. What makes a revolution absolutely inevitable is that we have a society based on the creation of value and production, which is increasingly valueless. What is value? Value is the exchange relationship between things. A cup is worth so many tape recorders, or this pair of shoes is worth so many marbles. It is the relationship between things. Thus, if one robot is producing cups and another robot is producing tape recorders, how do you equate them? If a human being makes a cup and a human being makes a tape recorder, you can equate their relationship by how much labor time went into making the cup and how much labor time went into making the tape recorder. You can establish relatively how many cups are worth how many tape recorders. But if a robot makes them, how do you then establish a value relationship between them? I don't think you can. Robots can make cars, but they cannot buy them. Since production is increasingly carried on without human labor, without creating value, such production cannot be distributed with money. Money expresses value. Expended labor time is the basis of exchange, and it is represented by money. You cannot sell them, and if you don't sell them, how are you going to distribute them? In his book, High Tech, Low Pay, the Marxist writer Sam Marcy observed the same problem. Profit does not come from machinery itself. It is from the labor of the worker. Workers produce a greater value than they receive back in wages, and it is the unpaid portion of their labor that produces surplus value. But a robot is not a worker. A robot is fixed or constant capital, which does not produce profit. As Marcy goes on to explain, the individual capitalists are driven to substitute labor-saving machinery for workers because it gives them a competitive advantage. For a certain period, the capitalist who is able to utilize the new technology and lower the unit cost of his product can actually enjoy a greater profit because the market reflects a generalized cost still based on the old technology. Eventually, however, the new technology itself becomes generalized and the rate of profit falls. The advantage to a higher composition of constant capital is always temporary. Moreover, it spurs on the destructive competition in which the equipment that could still be socially useful is made permanently obsolete. In order to compensate for the falling rate of profit, the owners are forced to increase the volume of profit. This can only be done by further increasing production. Much of the economic literature deals with the displacement of jobs as the result of the introduction of high technology, but it does not deal with the decline in the rate of profit from the long-range point of view. Technology is a double-edged weapon. Furthermore, automation does not solve the problem of capitalist contradiction that leads to economic crisis. On the contrary, it exacerbates it precisely because of the decline in the rate of profit. High technology does not produce high profits. It increases the productivity of labor, but decreases the proportion of labor used in production in relation to the amount of fixed capital. Where did the computer revolution come from? If you can understand that human labor creates all value, and how in a capitalist economy this leads to the problem of overproduction, which is then compounded by the tendency of the falling rate of profit, you can understand the crisis we are in. In 2014, many American moviegoers were entertained by a film called The Imitation Game. This was a historical drama portraying a true story about how a brilliant mathematician named Alan Turing was utilized by the British government during the Second World War to create an elaborate decoding machine. This decoding machine laid the basis for much of what has been described as the computer revolution. The film focused on the tragedy that Turing was widely unrecognized for his genius and ended up tragically committing suicide after being forced to take medication intended to cure his homosexuality. Many have noted that Apple, the symbol of one of the biggest computer corporations today, may actually have been some kind of demented inside joke about the fact that Turing committed suicide by eating an apple dipped in cyanide. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union invested in advancing computer technology. In 1970, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a Cold War strategist based at Columbia University, composed a book called Between Two Ages: America Enters the Technotronic Era. In the book, he argued that the new left of anti-war and civil rights protesters in the United States did not pose a danger of overthrowing Western capitalism. He pointed out that the various communist groups had no real base among the population, and that the rise in protests was not so much a revolutionary movement as it was a response to changes in the culture brought on by information technology. With more access to information, people in the United States and across the world were questioning old customs and habits. The way people interacted with authority and tradition was being renegotiated, and many people felt that stifled by Cold War conformity and wanted more social liberalism. Brzezinski argued that rather than fighting the new left, as the Nixon administration had done, the United States should embrace this wave of liberalism and rebellion wrought by information technology. He argued that putting the United States at the center of the information technological revolution could Americanize the world. The wave of cultural confusion and anti-authoritarianism information technology created could be utilized to sow dissent and destabilize the Soviet Union and the communist countries. With control of media, art, and culture, the United States could push its system of free market capitalism and its values of radical individualism to a position dominated to the world, a position of dominance in the world. Brzezinski went on to establish the Trilateral Commission, a think tank he directed along with Henry Kissinger. The strategy of using information technology to secure U.S. dominance became highly respected and accepted among the Council on Foreign Relations and the intelligence deep state. The so-called deep state began engaging in covert activities to ensure that the United States came out ahead in the computer revolution. Corporations like IBM, Apple, Microsoft, and eventually Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Amazon were created due to covert, but now admitted, support from the intelligence agencies. Money from the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the Department of Treasury, and other shadowy and unseen wings of the U.S. government provided loans and other forms of assistance to create what is now called Silicon Valley. California became the center of the computer revolution. The Soviet Union had its fair share of successes when it came to computer technology. The Soviet Union launched the first spacecraft, the Sputnik satellite. The Soviet Union had the first man in outer space. In 1957, Soviet engineer Leonid Ivanovich Kaprianovich patented the first mobile phone. However, the Soviet Union had begun its process of rapid industrialization in 1928. And prior to that, it had been non-industrialized and an agrarian society. The USSR simply did not have anything near the resources the United States had to invest in the computer revolution. While Western countries freely adopted Soviet technology and inventions like LED lights, the NATO countries created the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls. The New York Times described the treaty as organized to ensure that strategic technology such as computers, machine tools, and microelectronic items could not be used for weapons or other military applications and did not fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union went as far as manufacturing its own home computer system in 1985, the Electronica BK0010. Regardless, the technology embargoes and lack of resources enabled the United States to sit at the center of the global technology revolution. Ironically, this victory for Western civilization was not generated by the market. If Brzezinski had not reoriented the deep state and the intelligence apparatus had not poured resources and efforts into creating massive computer corporations, the market would never have enabled the USA to win the technology war. The very methods that Western capitalism used to win over communism involved strategic central planning and not market chaos. But regardless, we now live amid a huge leap in technology. Years ago, thousands of people worked in factories that produced books called bookbinderies. Now, a single book can be produced on command with a single person pushing a button. Short order cooks are becoming a thing of the past, along with assembly line workers of all kinds. Computers can trade stocks more effectively than humans can. Artificial intelligence and other breakthroughs are rendering human beings more and more irrelevant in the process of production. However, it is still from the wages paid out to workers that consumers derive their purchasing power. Furthermore, it is still only human labor that can generate profits for the capitalist. The built-in laws of capitalism have exploded into a long-term crisis of overproduction and falling profits. The huge monopolies that dominate the global market in the 21st century have gotten so good at producing goods that the world is now facing the greatest crisis of poverty amid plenty yet seen. The technological leaps have created a deep systemic crisis of capitalism. As Fred Goldstein explained in 2013, capitalist overproduction always caused these recessions. Production under capitalism expands very rapidly so long as there are markets. This is because of the laws of capitalist competition. The capitalists are in a permanent race to outproduce each other, to outsell each other, and to capture the markets from each other, as each wants to gain the most profit. This competition drives the system. But they fight each other by racing to lower wages, increasing production, and using technology to get rid of workers. So while production expands at a rapid pace under capitalism during a boom period, the income of the masses grows at a snail's pace, very gradually, or actually declines. Soon, the bosses find that they cannot sell their goods at a profit. So they shut down businesses and cut back workers' hours. The crisis of unemployment begins. This is the law of capitalism. It cannot operate in any other way. This is the profit system at work. This is the so-called boom and bust cycle. We say that capitalism is at a dead end because the traditional boom and bust cycle is over. There is no boom. It was the boom, or greatly increased production, that put workers back to work during past recoveries. But once the system loses the ability to bounce back and move forward and upward in production and services, a permanent crisis sets in for the workers and the oppressed. He went on, they have created a technological machine that is so productive and a low-wage workforce that is so impoverished that as soon as they increase production at a rapid rate, the system fails. People cannot buy the commodities produced. Inventories back up and no hiring goes on at all, or else layoffs take place. Capitalist productivity is strangling capitalist production. The capitalism of today, which is leading toward a more and more intense economic and social crisis, is not the capitalism of mere factory owners and wage workers. It is what Lenin called imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. It is the rule of the world by trusts, cartels, syndicates, huge monopolies based in Wall Street and in London. The Silicon Valley tech giants were preceded by the super major oil corporations and their respective houses of finance as the dominant axis within the global apparatus. As Lenin explained, the imperialist stage of capitalism is defined by financiers holding back and preventing economic development around the world in order to ensure their monopoly, carving out spheres of influence and captive markets in the colonized world. Imperialism is about holding back development throughout the world to preserve the monopoly of Western corporations tied in with big banks. While it would be normal for those who own businesses to want economic growth, the ultra-wealthy monopolists maintain their power by enacting degrowth. They want to impoverish the world and keep it poor so that they can stay on top. The people of Mexico have been growing their own food since before Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492. However, free trade policies of the North American Free Trade Agreement put an end to that. The Mexican farming sector has been eliminated. Mexico has been degrown, and Mexicans now import their food from American agribusiness corporations. More than a century ago, the British Empire burned the vast textile looms of India and forced the people who'd been weaving for centuries to import their cloth from Britain. No African country exports more oil at this time than Nigeria. The Niger Delta region is full of petroleum, one of the most vital commodities in our global economy. But the people of Nigeria live in utter poverty. The CIA World Factbook describes a life expectancy of only 60 for males and 64 for females. Only 62% of the adult population is literate. How can a country with so much natural wealth remain so impoverished? A key work by Guyanese writer and activist Walter Rodney is called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Imperialism is not about development, but keeping countries as impoverished, captive markets. The globalist nature of the 21st century capitalist economy recalls the words of British fascist Oswald Mosley, who bemoaned this emerging setup in the post-war years. The racist demagogue told his English audience in the early 1960s, quote, "Every one of us in this hall was old enough to see before the war. Every one of you knows what happened, how the financial forces in the 30s went into these backward countries, into India within the empire, into Hong Kong, into Japan, into China, and exploited these peoples to produce cheap sweated goods, which ruined the great industries of Britain and of Europe, which put Lancashire out of business in the cotton trade, Yorkshire out of business in the woolen trade. And these poor devils were exploited for a wage of a few shillings a week. For what purpose? To enable the City of London and Wall Street, New York, to make fatter profits. That is why it was done. That was the whole purpose. And all these countries who have been exploited, thrown and tossed aside by finance, are now becoming the victims of communism. So finance seeks fresh fields of exploitation. Where do they turn when the old people are exhausted? When many a poor laborer has died of consumption of other horrible diseases in their sweatshops? When they've exhausted fields of exploitation, where do they turn now? New pastures, new forests, fresh virgin lands. And these poor devils are going to be sweated and exploited in Africa, just like the poor devils in China, India, and Japan. A great new field of sweatshops to be opened up, so that these new industries we are creating in Britain today can be destroyed as the old industries were, simplified, rationalized machinery with a few white surveyors and the masses of cheap-colored labor torn off the land and taken into the sweatshops to work and labor and cough their guts out with tuberculosis. Is that worthy of Britain? Is that the future of empire? And is that competition to be organized within our European brotherhood, bringing these sweat fields in Africa into our European civilization so that the financial power of one European country can be used against the financial power in another? All the great financial power of the world now shifted from the City of London to Wall Street, New York, who shall be able, on the mass of money and wealth and of power it brings to it, again and again to exert its influence in politics, until, as you see today, it is childish nonsense to say that a British government rules Britain. It's nothing to do with British government or the British people. The government of the world is the financial government, the power of money, and of money alone. During the 20th century, the Western capitalist home countries were kept stable by a labor of well-paid industrial workers who were loyal to their bosses. The aristocracy of labor was made up of working-class people who saw their living standards increase along with the ascendancy of big corporations. This bought their loyalty and made them supportive of wars and defenders of the status quo. However, in the 21st century, the aristocracy of labor is being systemically destroyed. The once prosperous industrial cities have been reduced to ghost towns dotted with empty foreclosed homes. America's once booming suburbs have become centers of opioid addiction, human trafficking, bitter, decaying elderly people, and hopeless, angry youth. As the productive economy comes to a halt amid the long-term crisis of overproduction, the primary methods of profiteering among the already rich have become what some describe as destructive accumulation, prisons for profit, military contracting, an epidemic of addiction caused by doctors being pushed to overprescribe painkillers, The public education system is being auctioned off to the highest bidder in school choice charter schools, where private corporations make money from maintaining the youth. In 27 U.S. states, municipalities have become so indebted and bankrupt that they have begun unpaving the roads, replacing paved roads with gravel and dirt roads to save money on maintenance. The physical economy of the United States lies in ruin. The system has become cannibalistic, eating itself in order to keep profits flowing in, even when very little value is being created. This state of affairs cannot continue indefinitely without some kind of big dramatic fallout or correction. We should be reminded of Karl Marx describing how crises of overproduction are resolved. Quote, how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by the enforced destruction of the mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets and by the thorough exploitation of old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. How can this crisis be solved? The resolution of the long-term economic crisis facing Western capitalist countries can be found in abolishing the system of production for profit. To put it simply, a government of action that fights for working families must mobilize the populace to enforce rational planning and control over the means of production. The economy must be reinvented in order to function according to a central plan rather than merely the short-term gain of private owners. An economy where production is no longer dictated by profit, but rather on the basis of an overall plan is called socialism. Much like the word capitalism, this term has been subjected to a huge amount of confusion. All capitalist economies have somewhat of a state sector. Capitalist societies have roads paved by the government. The U.S. Constitution mandates the creation of a postal service that is publicly owned, not accountable to an individual owner. From the time of Adam Smith, even the most ardent free marketeers understood that some level of public works and state facilitation was necessary for the market to function. It is only since the 1970s that anyone has been so confused as to see the post office, the U.S. military, or the private Federal Reserve Bank as socialism. Socialism is not synonymous with state ownership. In post-World War II Britain, almost every major industry was nationalized. This was done so they could be rebuilt at the expense of the taxpayer in order to facilitate the restoration and functioning of British imperialism, the economic dominance of British bankers on the global stage. Saudi Arabia maintains a heavily state-controlled economy, but through the government is heavily involved, the economy functions to maximize profits for the ruling family and its various cronies. Singapore also has a heavily state-run economy, but it is run to generate profits for ruling families. Socialism is also not synonymous with taxation or redistribution of wealth. This goes on to some degree or other in all capitalist societies. Societies that maintain a bigger welfare state may have higher tax rates than those that maintain a more libertarian approach, but neither is more socialist or more capitalist than the other. The Norwegian welfare states that currently face dramatic confusion amid the inflow of refugees and their alliance with NATO, anti-Russian crusades, are not socialist countries. Capitalism is production for profit, and socialism is an economy where profits are not in command. Socialism emerged in the 20th century as country after country broke free from the domination of Western imperialism and seized control of its industries and natural resources. Socialism in the 20th century involved popular governments that emerged in explosive revolutionary upsurges, mobilizing the population to industrialize, electrify, and modernize deeply impoverished countries. The notion that socialism does not work should seem laughable to anyone familiar with basic economic history. The Russian Empire was an impoverished prison house of nations with massive illiteracy, a low life expectancy, and a primitive agrarian economy when the Bolsheviks took power in 1917. By 1936, it was fully industrialized and a superpower that produced more steel than any other country on Earth and had the biggest hydroelectrical facility ever constructed at that time, the Great Dnieper Dam. The 5-year economic plan, launched under the leadership of Joseph Stalin in 1928, transformed the lives of millions of people. A huge modern educational system was created, and illiteracy was wiped out. Modern universities sprung up. Great achievements in athletics and arts were carried out. The entire planet was in awe of the explosion of economic growth that socialist central planning was achieving for the once impoverished country. Writing for The Nation in 1931, Louis Fischer wrote, "The Soviet frontier is like a charmed circle which the world economic crisis cannot cross. While banks crash, while production fails, and trade languishes abroad, the Soviet Union continues in an orgy of construction and national development. The scale and speed of its progress are unprecedented." An American radio personality named Fraser Hunt, writing for the New York American in 1931, emphasized how dramatic the Soviet Union's explosion of economic growth really was. He said, "Japan, westernizing and industrializing itself 50 years ago, was doing child's play compared to what the Soviet Union is doing today. Already, almost overnight, the USSR has become an industrial country." The problems of the Soviet Union set in after the initial wave of industrialization. And during the 70s and 80s, the country was unable to adjust its socialist economic model due to changing circumstances. The inability to adjust led to a political crisis that saw the Soviet Union's demise. China, on the other hand, was able to rapidly adjust its socialist economic system, and starting in 1978, began its reform and opening up. China began speeding forward with 5-year economic plans, state-run banks and industries, and a Marxist-Leninist party in command. A report from the World Bank published on April 1st, 2022, quotes Manuel Ferro, World Bank Vice President for East Asia and Pacific, saying, "China's economy reduction story is a story of persistent growth through economic transformation." The article begins by stating, "Over the past 40 years, the number of people in China with incomes below $1.90 per day, the international poverty level as defined by the World Bank to track extreme poverty, has fallen by close to 800 million. With this, China has contributed close to 3/4 of the global reduction in the number of people living in extreme poverty. At China's current national poverty line, the number of poor fell by 770 million over the same period." The World Economic Forum published an article on September 11th, 2018, entitled "The Story of Vietnam's Economic Miracle." A mere 30 years ago, the country was the poorest in the world. The article went on, "Today, Vietnam is one of the stars of the emerging markets universe. Its economic growth of 6 to 7% rivals China, and its exports are worth as much as the total value of its GDP. Observing the source of Vietnam's strength, the World Economic Forum noted, Vietnam has invested heavily in human and physical capital, predominantly through public investments. Vietnam invested a lot in human capital and infrastructure. Facing a rapidly growing population, it stands at 95 million today, half of whom are under 35. And up from 60 million in 1986, Vietnam made large public investments in primary education. This was necessary, as a growing population also means a growing need for jobs. But Vietnam also invested heavily in infrastructure, ensuring cheap mass access to the internet. The fourth industrial revolution is knocking on Southeast Asia's door, and having sound IT infrastructure in place is essential. Those investments paid off. Armed with the necessary infrastructure and with free market policies in place, Vietnam became a hub of foreign investment and manufacturing in Southeast Asia. Since 2010, Vietnam's GDP growth has peaked at least 5% per year, and in 2017, it peaked at 6.8%. With such rapid economic growth, the country grew from one of the poorest countries in the world to a comfortably middle-income one. Whereas its GDP per capita was barely $230 in 1985, it was more than 10 times that in 2017, $2,343. Corrected for purchasing power, it stands even higher as of today at 6,000. There is certainly a role for private enterprise in a socialist economy, but profits and markets are not in control. A popular government is. The private enterprises are not free to function according to market logic, but are guided and controlled by state subsidies and oversight. The socialist economy of Nicaragua, under the leadership of the Sandinistas, has had astounding successes. Between 2005 and 2014, poverty in Nicaragua decreased by 30%, according to the Wall Street Journal. The GDP rose by 36% between 2007 and 2016. The shining success of the government, which rules under the slogan of Christianity, socialism, and solidarity, has been its micro-entrepreneurship program, which subsidizes low-income Nicaraguans to start individual businesses or worker cooperatives. The socialist government of Evo Morales in Bolivia oversaw similar explosions of growth, with the highest GDP expansion in South America for many years. A 2019 article from The Nation observes, during the Morales era, the economy has grown at twice the rate of the Latin American average. Inflation has been stable, and the government has amassed substantial savings. And an enterprising and optimistic indigenous middle class has emerged. The article described the policies through which the popular anti-imperialist government enabled this growth. Quote, Morales passed a law seizing tens of thousands of square miles of land deemed unproductive or illegally held and redistributed it to landless peasants. He placed the natural gas, oil, telecommunications, and electronic industries under state control. And he continually raised the minimum wage, which has tripled since he entered office. Morales has dramatically increased social spending. He poured money into building roads, schools, and hospitals, and expansion of infrastructure that was particularly transformative in the countryside. And he established modest but deeply popular cash transfer programs, a universal non-contributory pension system for Bolivians over the age of 60, assistance to households with elementary school-aged children who can demonstrate that their children are attending school, and funds for pregnant women and mothers with children under the age of 2 without health insurance. The living conditions of Cubans are far superior to those of Haitians, Dominicans, and Jamaicans in terms of access to healthcare, education, and employment. The Communist Party of Cuba presides over a socialist economy and has constructed what Ban Ki-moon called the greatest medical system in the world. Socialism in Libya built the world's greatest irrigation system, the man-made river. Under Gaddafi's leadership, Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent and experienced huge amounts of economic growth. Socialism constructed the massive Aswan Dam, the biggest hydroelectrical power plant in the Middle East, which fully electrified Egypt. Baath socialism brought running water, electricity, and literacy to Syria. When the chaos of the market, the anarchy of production is overcome, and economic growth is no longer restrained, socialist central planning enables human creativity and drive to expand, no longer held back. The problems inherent in production organized for profit are overcome. The solution to the crisis in the United States can be best summarized with the slogan, "We need a government of action to fight for working families." The state must step in and control the centers of economic power, forcing production to move ahead and wealth to increase. The invisible hand must be pushed aside, and a state that enacts popular will must assert itself over production. If a government came to power in Washington, D.C., and carried out the following 4 steps, the U.S. economy would regenerate very rapidly. 1, a mass mobilization to rebuild the country. A government of action would hire millions of unemployed or underemployed people and put them to work rebuilding the country. This would mean a mobilization by the state to build new hospitals, power plants, water treatment facilities, schools, universities, high-tech research facilities, and high-speed railways. 2, public ownership of natural resources. A government of action would institute public control over natural resources. The wealth generated from America's oil, natural gas, coal, and timber would go into the public budget rather than into the pockets of private owners. This would ensure that the state had enough resources to fund its efforts and stimulate the economy, oversee growth, and lift the burden of taxation from the population. 3, centralization of public control of banking and credit. A government of action would centralize credit and banking into the hands of the state, lending money strategically at a state, federal, and local level. Credit would be assigned based on enacting an overall economic vision and ensuring long-term growth, rather than simply profits of private lenders. The massive debt that hangs over the U.S. economy as a curse must be canceled, and the debt industry forcibly broken up by the state. 4. An economic bill of rights. A government of action could then implement an economic bill of rights, ensuring that the population has the right to jobs, housing, education, and health care. The population would be maintained for the overall good of the country. People would be seen as assets to society, capable of creating wealth and making the country stronger. Thus, it would be in society's interest to make sure the population is healthy, well-educated, and fully utilized for the good of the country as a whole. These actions would result in a rise in wages and near elimination of unemployment. Small businesses would flourish. Regions that are struggling and stagnated would be renewed and filled with prosperity and hope. These 4 steps are quite within the reach of the U.S. government. Governments across the planet have carried out similar endeavors. However, these 4 steps would erode the private property rights of wealthy corporations. The right of private bankers to lend money at interest would be eradicated. The oil and natural gas wells, the coal mines, and other natural resources that are private property of corporations would be seized by the public. The state would become the primary employer, with an industrial and construction army being mobilized to regenerate the economy. Taxes would decrease. Private property and personal property would still exist on a massive scale. Inequality of income would certainly remain a reality. None of these steps would be a socialist nightmare as envisioned by right-wingers. In fact, they would be the opposite. These steps would result in making America great again, more effectively than anything Trump has so far put forward. A wall along the border, protectionism in the form of tariffs and renegotiated trade deals, renewed emphasis on national sovereignty against globalism, these would be almost meaningless compared to these 4 dramatic steps. In order to enact all these 4 steps, a government would need to have massive public support, and this support could not come in the form of silent approval. A well-organized and awakened public would have to back these efforts of popular leaders to enact these policies. Though it seems far off, the conditions of the United States for such a government of action to emerge are indeed ripening. Divisions among the elite are intensifying, and conditions are worsening for the broad masses. And that is my pamphlet, my book, AI is Not the Problem.